Well, we're going to shift into basic steering and suspension now. A4, suspension and steering practice test. I like to say steering and suspension. Sometimes it says suspension and steering, you know, whenever you're looking at your different A4 stuff. Now let's see if we can punch into this 10-question test and see if we can get anything out of it. Question 1. A vehicle has a steering wheel that is off-center while driving straight. Which adjustment is used to center the wheel? Left and right tie rod ends, left and right upper control, left and right lower control arm, left and right strut bearing. Okay, which one would that be? You're driving down the road, the steering wheel's crooked. That just drive you crazy. Of course, they tell you in the textbooks you need it to be straight when you're driving straight down the road so you can see the speedometer without obstruction. But if you're just a little bit OCD, a steering wheel that looks like this when you're driving down a straight road will drive you wacky. And what you're going to need to do is center the steering wheel, put it up on the front end left if you're the guy doing the alignment. Of course, you guys that are doing alignments already know this. And you jiggle the wheel back and forth on the, the plates that you get your front wheel sitting on. They got bearings under them, so they'll roll freely when you're turning them wheels back and forth, and it doesn't stress the steering components. So if you jiggle the wheel and make sure that it's right in the center and that that's where it wants to be, and then you take your steering wheel holder and put it under there so that the steering wheel can't move, and then you do your adjustments and you set your toe. I don't know how many times I had students that would do an alignment and everything else would be perfectly right, but this is something you cannot see unless you, driving it down the road is the best way, but you can get in there while watching the screen on your machine and go back and forth and stop it at 0 again and see if the wheel's centered that way. But a lot of the times they'd pull the thing off the lift and they'd go and drive it, and they couldn't, they noticed the steering wheel was a little bit off. And so what that means, you got to put it back on the lift, you got to put the machine back on it, you got to redo your toe adjustment. And a lot of them just flat didn't want to do that. Now on the 91 Dodge 4-wheel drive truck, believe it or not, we had the president of college had one of them for a while. What you had to do on that thing was you had to do your toe adjustment, which it was really odd the way that one was set up. I should have put a picture of it up here. After you got your toe adjusted, you were supposed to pull the steering wheel off and put it back on there straight. I'm not kidding. It didn't have a master's plan. It was made so you could do that after you did your toe adjustment, because it only had one adjustment, for both sides. It was one big long bar and then threads, like a turnbuckle sort of. Anyway, that was an interesting thing on that one. All right, question 2. What are the most likely effects of a broken or disconnected front anti-sway bar link? Will it pull hard during stops? Will it lean more during turns? Will it shake more during turns? Will it wander during hard stops? Well, that is something I did not even know about the significance of a sway bar until my dad acquired a 58 Volkswagen Bug. He had a bug shop, and we crammed an engine in that thing, and I was going to take that and let it be my secondary ride for possum hunting or whatever, just driving through mud. And it was just the gray one. I've had pictures on here before. Well, when I first drove that thing, after we got that, it did not have a sway bar on it because it was built without one in 58. So I took that thing and I drove it on a dirt road, and I said, this thing drives terrible. Whenever you turn the wheel to the right, it feels like it's going to turn over to the left, and vice versa. I never felt anything quite like this. This is ridiculous. And Dad says, well, you're going to need to take the sway bar off of that 64 model down there that's sitting in the weeds and put it on there. And so after I took that, actually I had to take the whole front axle, not just the sway bar, the whole front axle out of that 64 model and bolt it up under that 58 model. It was a lot of work, but it didn't hurt me to do it. Got it all put together, got the brakes bled and all that sort of stuff, and that thing handled like a Porsche compared to the way it handled when it didn't have a sway bar at all. And of course that one was built without one, and I actually upgraded the suspension and put one on it. A lot of times you won't know. Sometimes you may not even feel this very much, but you may hear a pop noise when you're turning. And that can be through the SUVs that have a sway bar on the rear and the front. If the rear sway bar links or deteriorate the way that you see the one over here, then this thing here will pop up and down, and you'll hear it. And those sway bar links, though, are usually very easy to change, and they don't cost much if you have this style. Now, there are other sway bar links that are more vehicle specific. You notice this has got a locking nut. See that staked place on that nut? That means that when you screw it on there, it's tight, so it won't come loose. But you got to be able to stack these things on here the right way. And some of the students would, as they put these sway bars on here, and they would just make a terrible mess out of putting these things on. They put both of these on one side, upside down, just a big mess. So I had to be really careful to make sure that I drew a picture for them of you put that one, the rubber, but with the sway bar between it, the rubber, that, and then the spacer, so on and so forth. That was really important. And a lot of times you having to assemble the thing. If you don't have a mental picture of how it goes, you'll make a mess of it. Question 3. Power steering pump's making a whining noise. Loud whining noise that changes with engine speed. What's the first step? Check the pump pulley, check the fluid level, check the belt tension, check the rack grease. Rack grease, really. So now this is important too, because this particular one was an 06 model. The fluid level was checked, which is what you need to do, and it was full, but we had to use, I bought this oil filler cap, this rubber push-in oil filler cap, this stamp thing, and modified it, and then I put this hose in it, put it through that little alkylation bottle to engine vacuum. Now the GM said you're supposed to use a vacuum pump for this in their PSBs. But anyway, we would turn the wheel, raise it up so you're not stressing the front end component, turn the wheels back and forth, and let this vacuum, that low pressure, draw the air out. It was full of fluid, but for some reason it got air in it. And she had gone to the dealer and an independent shop, and they told her that she needed to replace the power steering pump. She didn't need the power steering pump. She just needed to do this vacuum operation on it, or we actually did it. And so I built that tool, use that little barb to, drill a hole through that General Motors rubber oil filler cap from an old 350 Chevy. And then it was a new one I bought. The old ones will be so hard you can't do much with them. And this thing would squeeze right down into that. You're gonna have to build you an adapter that works for the one you're working on. Later we did some work on a Cadillac of some kind. Can't remember what the deal was with that. But it seemed like we had to replace the power steering pump, and it had some cavitation in it. Usually you'll fill it up with fluid, you'll turn it back and forth, and it'll work itself out and all that kind of thing. You're driving around a parking lot and all, and turn it, in the slow parking lot, turn it to the stops and all. Always try to make sure you're moving when you turn your wheels, and it doesn't stress the front end components as much as it does just sitting there doing that scrubbing on the pavement, on the scrub radius. Anyway, the long and the short of it was we did this same operation on that Cadillac, and it was so quiet when we got through doing this vacuum pump operation on it, you could not even hear anything from the power steering. And we fixed that 2006 model that way too. We fixed another one that I've got a video on about bleeding the power steering. It was on a 2001 Montana that we worked on, quite a bit at the shop. We had to do that one on that one. Question 4. While performing a dry park check, the technician should have an assistant start the engine, have an assistant pump the brake, have an assistant raise the vehicle, or have an assistant move the wheel. This was one of the first things I learned when I went to work at that gas station over there. Dad didn't have a whole lot of loose front end parts under those Volkswagen Bugs and stuff that he worked on in buses. You could have, but it wasn't anything. It was as common as it was on a front wheel drive car where the engine's sitting over the weight over the vehicles.
Anyway, this right here,
damper was leaking.
this tends to be a big problem. But this is a killer. If this thing comes off down the road, this tire turns into a shopping cart wheel.
What I was warning about was if this ball joint, if this tie rod end comes apart, you suddenly got a shopping cart wheel on there. I have seen this happen in real time when I was driving behind a friend of mine that had a 77 or 78 model Dodge pickup truck. And him and another friend of mine were going away home from work down in southeast Texas on Highway 87 between Sabine Pass and Port Arthur. And he was driving down that straight road, and all of a sudden his tailgate started shifting back and forth like this, and he was all over the road. If there'd have been another vehicle coming, it would have killed him. He would have gone right up under the, but he wound up getting it off the side of the road, and one of the tie rod ends had come apart. It was a disaster. There was a girl that was in my program that had a Power Stroke diesel. It was like can't remember, something like a 96 model or something. And she drove all the way from where she lived, bouncing around over here, and she pulled into the parking lot. And so she told me, she said, I'm going to move my truck from where I parked it to a different spot. She was one of my students. And whenever she started to move it, as soon as she turned the wheels, the tie rod end popped loose and fell apart. You can see the ball and all that stuff. And she totally lost steering on that thing. Right after having driven at 25 miles, bouncing over rough roads and all that kind of stuff. See, if this kind of thing happens while you're driving down the road, it is an epic disaster. You cannot ignore something like this, or somebody is liable to die. Now, on the other hand, there are shops. A lot of these tire shops, and some of them are franchise brand shops. There's one of them that's not far from here that routinely, anytime somebody goes in there for any kind of work, an oil change or whatever, they'll immediately go in there if they're a person that seems like they're not too smart, or they're elderly, or they don't know anything, and they'll tell them, you're going to have $800 worth of front end work, or you're going to die. And they're too afraid not to pay for that. But my aunt decided that she, on her 92 Crown Victoria, they told her that. And I'd seen this repeatedly, and this other guy that owned a shop over here told me he saw it all the time when somebody would be told something like that. My aunt brought her Crown Victoria over to the college, and we raised it up on the lift, and I didn't see even a busted boot on anything, and there was no slack anywhere. Where she grabbed the tire at 6 and 9 and pull on it to see if you got loose tie rods. You grab it at 12 and 6 and pull on it to see if you got bearing or ball joint issues. So anyway, I went on about that. I hope I didn't mess up by talking over my voice on this other video. I should have muted that one. Which alignment angle is most likely to cause rapid tire wear if it's set incorrectly? Now, I hope you guys appreciate the fact that I built these diagrams just for you, just for a day. You won't see this exact diagram anywhere else. So, which alignment is most likely to cause rapid tire wear? It's going to be your toe. Now, you can get tire wear if your camber is set like this. Caster doesn't typically cause tire wear. Steering axis inclination, we'll talk about that again in a minute. Toe is the one that's most likely to cause rapid tire wear, because when you're driving down the road, if the toe's not set right, the tires are scrubbing sideways as well as rolling forward. And that will make a feather edge if you drag your fingers across the tread from the top. Make sure there's not any wire sticking out, like if it's bad worn out. And you feel, gently dragging, and you feel sawtooth. That means it's been scrubbing sideways. Feathered edges, worn out right here. Now, let me tell you this. If you're working on a vehicle that drives around in a parking lot a lot, like a security guard's vehicle, or somebody that's always going slow, always making slow turns in a parking lot, going around the buildings and all that, the simple fact that the front tires are having to steer the truck during sharp turns going slow will wear the tires out on the outside edge, because especially if you're turning both ways. Now, if you're always turning the same way, only one of them will be worn, and that'll be very odd. But anyway, the whole point is wear on the edge, feather edges. I'm talking about the sawtooth feel here, and feather edges there. That shouldn't be your toe adjustment thing. Question 6, a front-wheel drive vehicle, listen.
And we're making that stream.
I talked over that. I wonder if I had to play that. Anyway, you can feel this one here. Now this one here was going look like real quick. I shouldn't have been talking when that thing went through, but that was a 2012 Toyota Camry. And it was in really good shape. Didn't have many miles on it. Didn't have any busted boots anywhere underneath it at all, but it was clicking because it had a warning. And this is the actual CV. Notice this Toyota Camry CV joint's got 8 balls. If you're used to driving one with 6 balls, it's got a different cadence to the clicking, which also confused us. And it'll go click, 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 click. And this other one, it had a lot faster frequency between the clicks. And it had a worn outer CV joint because on that Toyota, when we tore it down, there was not enough grease in that thing when they built it. The boot wasn't busted, but it was worn out and it was dimpled. You see the dimples here? The dimple in the channel and the dimple here is what you're looking at right there. And as those balls are rolling in and out of those dimples when you're in a turn, it's not so bad when you're going straight at all. As those balls roll in and out of those dimples, that's what makes that clicking noise. And like it was so unusual, and I had actually done a video on this particular Toyota 2 or 3 years ago. It was an extremely unusual situation all the way around because we absolutely could not get the right CV axle from the parts house for this thing. They kept sending the wrong one, and finally, in order to get one that would fit, I had to buy a CV axle. It seemed to me like a 2009 model CV axle I had to buy. The dealer wanted $500 for a CV axle, and the little $65 or $70 CV axle. I found out that the splines on the CV axle, it seemed like the one that they kept sending me had I had 31 splines, and the one that was on there had 24 splines, and that's a long story, but I can talk about that another time. What do SAI, toot, included angle, and setback have in common? They're routine service angles adjusted at every alignment. They're fixed diagnostic angles not normally adjustable. They're tire wear angles corrected by front toe changes. Or D, they are steering pull angles set only by caster hub shims. Okay, so you got steering axis inclination. And of course, incidentally, the place where these lines right here intersect is called the scrub radius. That's not anything I covered on this video, but that's what it's called. Setback is when you got shorter wheelbase on one side than the other, and toe out on turns, so on and so forth. So here you got these are fixed diagnostic angles not normally adjustable. Now if your steering axis inclination is out of spec, something's bent. You can't adjust it. You can replace parts and recheck it, but you can't adjust it. Included angle is technically not an adjustable angle either, although you are going to change that when you set your camber and then your shorter wheelbase with setback. That can be either because of the design of the vehicle for road crown issues or your damage from some reason, like something's bent. But you'll be able to, typically your better systems will have the specs on what the setback should be, along with the thrust line and everything else. Toe out on turns, the inner tire on a turn's got to turn sharper than the outer one, or one of them is going to be scrubbing and dragging and wearing out tires. And that's something, this is Ackerman geometry thing. This is a lot more complicated than you think. This friend of mine was building a go-kart from scratch and having to set up all of his turning, his front end stuff. He was building all that from scratch too. And he says the geometry on a steering system is a heck of a lot more complicated than you think it is. That's what he ran into. Question 8. If a vehicle has memory steer, what is one likely cause? Clogged return line, binding ball joints, bent control arms, leaking rack seals. That's when you turn the wheel and then you want to come back and it tries to stay where you turned it to. In other words, it doesn't go back and forth very smoothly. It just tries to stay where it was that you turned it. binding ball joints is what that is. And here we are, quick using the tool and actually changing this ball joint. I cut that threaded part of that ball joint off so we could punch it out of there real easy. And I used a high-speed cutter to do that, and we get the ball joint out. It's also a good idea, and I talk about this all the time, you put grease on those threads, you're going to get that thing out there a whole lot easier. It's the same way with pulling a power steering pump pulley. Put grease on the threads. I have seen people in my department at the college would not put, we just get a, power steering pump pulley puller, and whenever they were putting so much pressure on it, because they had one that was specifically very hard, and they would weld the tool together. The thing would quit turning because they didn't put grease on it. It would just get so hot, and it would begin to stretch the threads, and these two pieces of metal would become one and the same. That's not going to happen on this big old ball joint tool, but it's always a whole lot easier when you put your 7/8 socket on the top of this thing with your impact wrench, if you'll go ahead and smear some grease on those threads so that it's nice and slick and greasy, because you're going to increase the clamping force, the pressing force, exponentially with greasy threads over dry threads. Question 9. What is the primary purpose of a shock absorber in a conventional suspension system? Does it prevent vehicle oversteer, holds vehicle aligned angles, dampens spring oscillations, or assists with unsprung weight? Alright.
Are we bouncing it? Get it started bouncing.
Dampen spring oscillation. This is how you tell if the shocks are worn out. You guys say, well, if it comes up more than twice after you get through bouncing, you got really this Cadillac. Boing, 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 boing. That was one that one of the administrators on the other campus. And that's always kind of fun, replacing shock absorbers and seeing the difference and all. I will say this, though, these nitrogen-filled shock absorbers will cause the vehicle, when you put new ones on there, if they're nitrogen filled, they are going to cause the vehicle to sit up a little higher. But the ones that are OEM are going to be nitrogen filled, but they're going to be usually smoother. I have had people come in and they say, well, I just put brand new shocks on this thing that I bought online or whatever, and it feels like the suspension is hard and kind of bouncy. But if you buy OEM shocks, they cost more, but they usually ride better than some of your aftermarket shocks. This particular one, we bought shocks from the Cadillac dealer because I called the parts store, and he bought them from the Cadillac dealer and marked them up. And his driver just picked them up from the Cadillac dealer and brought them over, and they had the Cadillac dealer's name and label and all that kind of stuff on there. And so he did that so he could get them quick, and that's okay, but he charged me $140 per shock at the time. That was more than I expected to pay. And I called the parts manager and I said, did you buy these from the dealer and mark them up and send them to me? And no, that was something I had in stock. I said, well, then why do they have the dealer's name and address on a UPS sticker that's on the doggone thing? He just flat out lied. He says, yeah, I bought them over there, marked them up. What do you want me to do? I got them for you fast. I mean, instead of lying to me and telling me, no, I had those in stock, which I knew better than that because the guy had just come from the dealer and brought them directly to us. And then, we had that $140 bill. Anyway, I didn't ask for money back or anything like that, but I just told the guy, once somebody lies to you like that, it's very difficult to trust them to tell you the truth after that. Question 10. When a tire shows cupping tread wear patterns, which component is usually failing? Center drag link, steering pinion, strut assembly, or idler arm bushing? Alright, that's going to be the strut assembly. If you're shocked, if your tire's bouncing up and down. I had another video I actually took going down the road, and I could not find it in my system anywhere. If you don't remember what you named a file, you're not going to be able to find it if you got 1,000 videos like I do. But I was driving along, and this vehicle had a wheel that was literally bouncing up and down about 6 inches each way while the vehicle was driving down the road. It was an incredible video that I took. I'll find it one day and throw it at you guys, but I thought that was very interesting. You front end and serious suspension experts, correct me if I'm wrong about this. Let me know. if this did anything for you, and I'll really appreciate you coming by, and I'll talk to you next week. Don't fail to make a comment or share the video.